Welcome to today's Energy Central webcast entitled ScottMadden's Energy Industry Update, Don't Stop Believin'. A few housekeeping notes we'd like to mention. For best results in viewing this presentation, we recommend using a wired high-speed internet connection, as wireless connections can be unpredictable. If you cannot get adequate sound from your computer speakers, you may dial into the conference using your telephone. The telephone number is listed in the right-hand panel. I'm happy now to, if you do have questions following the presentation, we have a question and answer segment set aside. Please submit your questions at any time throughout the presentation. Now I'd like to turn the floor over to our moderator, Kristen Lyons, who's a partner and energy practice leader there at ScottMadden. Kristen, welcome to the event. You have the floor.
Thanks very much, PJ. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. For those of you who aren't familiar with ScottMadden, we're a general management consulting firm specializing in energy. During today's webinar, my colleagues are going to present on 3 topics that appeared in our semi-annual Energy Industry Update, our EIU, that was released last week. The theme of this EIU is Don't Stop Believin', and this reflects where we are in this industry on a number of topics. We have believers literally on all sides of many issues. We have believers in the need for new infrastructure and in the belief that we need no new infrastructure, whether that be electric transmission or gas pipelines. We have believers in the fossil fuel debate advocating for leaving it in the ground. We have believers in distributed energy resources and in central station generation. And we have believers in non-carbon emitting resources and in fossil baseload. So literally there are believers everywhere today. So today's webinar is going to focus on 3 topics that are particularly relevant in the industry and that were covered in this EIU. So first, Justin Stevens, who is a director with us, is going to present on efficient electrification. Second in the lineup is Chris Sturgill, who is a manager in our Raleigh office, and he's going to discuss grid modernization and our approach to planning those investments. And last but not least, Jennifer Nelson, who is a director out of our Westboro office, is going to talk about gas and power infrastructure development and some of the challenges we face there today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Justin to start us off with efficient electrification. Justin?
All right, thank you, Chris. So during this section, we're going to talk about efficient electrification, and we're going to address a few specific items on this topic. So first, we'll start out by level setting with a working definition of what we mean by efficient electrification, and we'll identify some of the key technologies that are involved. Next, we're going to move on to what electrification might mean to different stakeholders and some of the expected outcomes that these various groups are looking to see. After that, we'll review the findings from a couple of recent studies that have been published on this topic and pull out a few interesting insights and implications about future electrification scenarios. And then lastly, we'll revisit those stakeholder groups at the end and see if those expected outcomes that we mentioned at the top are really likely to come to fruition. So moving on to the first slide here. What is electrification? So a simple definition of electrification is the switching from energy supplied by non-electricity based fuel like natural gas or propane to electricity to provide a comparable service. We're also starting to hear terms like beneficial electrification or efficient electrification, which are slightly more specific. So you can see the definition, this EPRI's definition of efficient electrification at the bottom of the page. They define it as electrifying the end use of energy where it is more efficient to do so for the benefit of customers, the environment, and society. So it's not just switching to electricity, but doing so for some beneficial or societal purpose. And you can see in the middle of the page here that there are a lot of different technologies that could potentially be electrified across all major sectors of the economy. It's widely seen that electric vehicles in the transportation sector represent the largest potential for electrification, but there are technologies that are being electrified today in each of these areas and are forecasted to grow in the future. And we'll dig into each of these in a little bit more detail in a minute. Moving on to the next slide. So first, let's take a look at some of the stakeholder groups that have an interest in electrification and what the implications are for those groups. starting with electric utilities who see electrification as potential for much needed load growth. We're in a time right now of declining loads because of energy efficiency, distributed generation, and overall just a less energy intensive economy. So the potential for an increase in load is seen as a welcome opportunity for these utilities, and they're actively looking to encourage and incentivize it. Meanwhile, you have environmental groups and some local governments that see environmental benefits that come from electrification, such as reduction of greenhouse gas emissions and air pollution by switching away from high-emitting fuel sources to electricity generated by cleaner, more renewable power sources. There may be other potential environmental benefits as well, such as reduction in water use, less exposure to hazardous chemicals, and less noise pollution. For natural gas utilities, electrification could be seen as a threat, as it could lead to a decrease in gas consumption at a time where their industry is experiencing growth and is expanding due to cheap natural gas prices. And then lastly, we have the end users of these technologies, which we saw a minute ago could range from drivers of electric vehicles to users of heavy industrial equipment. Some of these groups may be motivated by environmental or other reasons, but for the most part, widespread adoption of electrified technologies by these users are likely to be driven by the cost and performance of the individual technologies. So those are some of the interested stakeholders. Now let's dig into some of these recent reports that have been published on this topic to test the accuracy of some of those ideas. Next slide. So 3 different organizations have recently published reports on this topic: NREL, EPRI, and AGA. NREL study examines the potential impact and opportunities of electrification across different sectors of the U.S. energy system. EPRI's U.S. National Electrification Assessment examines potential future scenarios and models some forecasts using various assumptions around technology advances and prices on carbon. And then the AGA looks very specifically at policy-driven electrification in the residential sector and the switching of gas-fueled furnaces and water heating to electric heating sources. Moving on to page 8. This is from the NREL report, which, as I said, examines the potential for electrification across different sectors. And if you look at the graph on the left here, when you hear about electrification today, the conversation tends to be dominated by electric vehicles. And you can see why when you look at this chart. Less than 1% of the transportation sector today is currently electrified. So it represents far and away the largest opportunity. And both NREL and EPRI do project significant increases in electric vehicles in the scenarios that they studied. And that's driven primarily by an assumption of decreasing battery costs. The other technology you hear a lot about are heat pumps, which if you look over on the right side of the graph here, within the residential and commercial building sectors, water and space heating do represent the most significant opportunity for electrification, even though this sector is largely already electrified today. One area that you don't hear as much about is the industrial sector, which you can see in the red bar of the graph here. For the most part, is powered by non-electrified sources today. So that suggests that there could be some opportunity. We have seen some successful efforts to electrify this sector. For instance, forklifts or electric forklifts have seen widespread adoption, accounting for about 2/3 of the U.S. market today. NREL concluded, however, that the opportunity to electrify in this sector is relatively limited because of higher upfront switching costs and just the diversity of technology types within the area. Moving on to slide 9. So this is from the EPRI report. EPRI found that customer adoption of electrified technologies will lead to an increase in electricity demand, and that electricity will represent a significantly higher percentage of final energy in the U.S. by 2050. So you can see that on the graph on the left. And these are from EPRI's reference scenario, but these findings held true in all the scenarios that they studied. What's interesting to note, though, is that overall energy consumption of all fuels is actually projected to decrease over this period, and that's due primarily to energy efficiency and lower energy intensity. So while the jump in electricity's share of final energy from 21 to 36% here is significant, the actual increase in electricity demand is relatively moderate. And you can see that in the graph on the right, which shows 32% increase in load growth from 2015 to 2050. So over the 35 years study, that's about 1% per year. I'm moving on to the next slide. It's important to note that the type of load growth that we could see with electrification may look different than what we're used to, and there are some important considerations for utilities as they start to think about their planning processes. So these graphs here are from the NREL report as well. The graph on the left shows that load duration curves for the different scenarios that NREL modeled. What we see here is an increase in load across all hours per year, which, given what we just talked about on the previous slide, is to be expected. And then if you look at the graph on the right, NREL estimates that load factors will increase over time for all the scenarios modeled as well. Now, this is a change. For context, from 1990 to 2016, load factors have remained relatively constant. And the increase that we see here is driven by an assumed flexibility of charging times for electric vehicles, which will result in a more consistent load profile throughout the day. So the implication here is that the optimal mix of generation technologies to serve this load may differ from today. Not pictured on this page, but another interesting finding in the NREL report is that the greater use of space and water heating is likely to shift some peak demand to the winter months. So in 2015, all states, except for a few in the Pacific Northwest, are estimated to be summer peaking, and a majority of the top 100 load hours occur in June, July, or August, the summer months. By 2050, under NREL's reference scenario, it still largely holds that most states have an absolute peak in the summer. However, a greater fraction of those top 100 peak hours occur in the winter months, and this was especially true in southern states. So this has implications for utilities in terms of their planning processes, the design of time of use rates, dispatch of wind and solar resources, and workforce planning. Moving on to page 11, this comes from the AGA report, which I mentioned looked specifically at the impact of policy-driven electrification in the residential sector. Perhaps not surprisingly, AGA had a little bit of a different take than the first two organizations that we looked at. Some of their key takeaways from the report were that residential natural gas today accounts for a very small portion of greenhouse gas emissions. So the opportunity there in terms of reduction through electrification is relatively small. They also noted that electrification will lead to higher power sector emissions, so that will at least partially offset any savings from residential natural gas consumption. And this was true even in cases where they modeled that all incremental generating capacity was from renewable sources. AGA's analysis also said that residential customers' total costs were likely to increase under electrification scenarios. This was due to the cost of new appliances as well as utility bill impacts from required upgrades to the grid. And then lastly, and what you see in the chart on this page, is that AGA noted that residential electrification is a much costlier way to get to greenhouse gas reductions than other options, such as fuel efficiency measures, coal generation retirement, or even atmospheric CO2 removal. So we move on to page 12. It's important to note that all of the scenarios presented in these reports are based on sets of assumptions about technology, prices, and behavioral responses. And these assumptions could point to limitations or significant growth opportunities. Some of these assumptions are advances in technologies like lithium-ion batteries or electric heat pumps. Both the efficiency and the performance of those technologies, as well as their continued declining costs, will make them more or less attractive to consumers. Commodity prices will also be a driver, so the increase in the current price of natural gas or the price of oil would make electrification more attractive. And meanwhile, the cost of electricity obviously is a key input into just the economic case for the adoption of any technology. Behavioral responses will also play a role. It's always hard to predict the pace at which consumers might adopt or switch over to a new technology, or what that tipping point might be that leads to widespread adoption. And then lastly, policy will play a role. So mandates, incentives, and any kind of a cost on carbon will certainly impact the timing and the scale of electrification. So moving to slide 13, just to wrap up here, some of our key takeaways. EPRI projects that electricity will increase substantially as a percent of total energy by 2050, but due to offsets from energy efficiency and energy intensity, the actual growth in electricity demand is going to be relatively moderate, at least in their reference scenario. While there are opportunities in other areas, the transportation sector definitely appears to have the highest and most immediate potential for electrification. The type of load growth we might see could lead to different load profiles, increasing peak loads, and increasing load factors. So that has implications for utilities as they plan grid investments and as they think about the future power generation mix. And then lastly, there are some barriers to the adoption of specific technologies, including high upfront costs, low natural gas prices, and then the evolution of individual technologies in terms of both cost and design. So short of any significant policy-driven support, those are really the factors to monitor when assessing the likelihood of widespread electrification. So that is it on this topic. I welcome any questions or comments at the end, and Kristen, I'll turn it back over to you.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Justin. As I mentioned, our next topic is going to be grid modernization, and Chris Sturgill is going to speak to that. Chris?
Thank you, Kristen. So grid modernization is a commonly used term in the industry today, but one without really a consensus definition. In this section of the webinar, we'll look at different perspectives on defining grid modernization, why that's happening, where the activity is taking place in some of the latest news, what type of investments fall under the grid modernization umbrella, how these investments are evaluated and paid for, and how you can approach developing a grid modernization program. So next slide, please. We'll start by diving right in on the definitions. What we have on the screen now is two definitions, the top left from the New York Joint Utilities and the bottom right from the Minnesota Public Utility Commission from their 2016 report. I'm not going to attempt to read these verbatim during the webinar here today, but what I'd like to call your attention to are two aspects of this. The first is the length. These are quite lengthy definitions. The grid modernization topic is expansive. Trying to define it concisely is challenging. The second aspect of this that I'll call your attention to are there common elements within each, highlighted here in the blue text. These include enabling greater customer engagement through information, building a more reliable and resilient grid, using grid assets more flexibly and more efficiently, and integrating DERs, although different states have taken different approaches on that based on policy. Moving on to the next page. So what's driving grid modernization? Why is this happening today? Utilities have been integrating new technology as it matures for a century now. But what sets grid modernization apart as unique is the confluence of these five factors. First up is customer expectations. Customer expectations for their utility service are no longer being driven by how they've interacted with the utility in the past. Instead, it's being driven more by the customer expectations from other services they use, like Uber for ride hailing or Amazon for the up-to-the-minute status updates of your package. Second is technology advances. Advances in technology have increased the performance of different technologies while decreasing the costs. Perhaps most notably, this includes reduced costs on cloud computing and storage, which enables big data analytics, but it also shows up in the decreased cost and increased capability of telecommunications and sensing devices. To close out the third row, or to close out the top row, the third item, is DER penetration. Things like rooftop solar or residential batteries. This is changing the way that utilities have to plan and operate their grid. As these resources can provide beneficial services like localized energy or capacity, or they can exacerbate negative conditions like voltage fluctuations. So as these proliferate, utilities need ways to monitor and perhaps control these devices at the grid edge. Moving into the bottom row is the trend of aging infrastructure. Utility assets are long-lived, but a lot of them were installed in the post-World War II boom. This means they're nearing the end of their life and presents both a challenge and an opportunity to affect change on a large scale. And finally, policy drivers. Increasingly, state commissions, governors, or legislatures are establishing policy goals that utilities must then figure out how to address. This could mean things like integrating more energy storage or optimizing their energy efficiency programs. So taken as a whole, these 5 forces are now driving an increased focus on grid modernization for utilities above and beyond the business as usual upgrades of the past. Next slide, please. So where is this activity happening? The short answer is almost everywhere. So this is a graphic put together by the North Carolina Clean Energy Technology Center, which tracks the activity in each state. And you see the darker blue color means the more activity there is. In some states, this is more than 10 actions in a single quarter. And you see some of the usual suspects you would expect to see there: New York, California, Hawaii. But what I want to call your attention to, and what you can read about in more detail in the EIU, is some activity that's taking place in places that don't get as much of the publicity. So I'll give you one example. Please refer to the EIU for more. But in Ohio, regulators recently proposed the Power Forward initiative that focuses on a resilient, optimized, and efficient grid that serves as an open access platform. We're expecting dockets to be established in 2019 that focus on the necessary investments for future grid capabilities. Next slide, please. So what makes up this stuff? Here we have our different technologies grouped into 5 buckets. We'll start at the bottom with the foundational investments. And this is really key because these are immediate and long-term investments that provide benefits today, but also enable other investments shown above. Things like AMI, a GIS, or an ADMS here can provide the immediate benefits of enhanced metering or enhanced control, but also then enable the equipment that's shown above. Working our way around clockwise, we'll go next to the flexible resources, which can include the DER themselves or the management systems used to control them. Further around is the distribution automation, which are the communicating sensors or switches that can operate autonomously or through those centralized control systems like the ADMS in the foundation. Further around is tools and analytics, which is advanced technologies, including analytics to enable decision-making, really making use of all the data that's being produced by these other investments and enhancing your operations or your planning. And finally, the grid edge sensing. This is similar to distribution automation, but think about it as one way. So where you have SCADA or control elements in the distribution automation category, this is more sensors like environmental sensors or pole tilt sensors that just give you a clearer picture of what's happening on your grid. Next page, please. So once you've got your pile of investments, you've got to sort of look at them and figure out how to justify them. There are big dollars at stake with these grid modernization programs, and ensuring prudency is a must. So the industry and government have been working to define a framework for this. The framework shown here is an adaptation of the DSPX framework that was put out by the Department of Energy. Hawaiian Electric Company subsequently used that in their grid modernization proceeding. And what you see is things that fall into 4 buckets. First, those that are necessary to maintain the reliability standards or safety. Second, those necessary for policy compliance. Third, those that are not needed for standard safety or policy requirements, but which provide net benefits to customers. And then fourth, investments that are incurred for a specific customer and subsequently paid by that customer. The dividing line in the middle shows the left-hand side is more mandatory investments needed to fulfill your charge of providing safe, reliable power or meeting the local policies. The right-hand side are those that are positive cases. Top right corner, the net benefits case, something like AMI would fall in here. AMI provides a number of efficiencies for meter reading, for conservation of voltage, and when those benefits outweigh the cost, that provides net benefits to the customer base. The self-supporting are sort of by their nature beneficial. If the customer sees enough value to proceed in that example, then the value outweighs the cost for them. Next page, please. So I'll move through this rather quickly. There's three primary mechanisms for paying for these investments. First is the normal rate case process where the utilities seek recovery for their investments. Southern California Edison took that route. Next up is grid modernization riders, typically more targeted regulatory mechanisms with generally a higher bar to clear. We've seen utilities like Xcel Energy use that for their ADMS and time of use pilot. We've also seen Duke Energy, on the other hand, submit an investment package for a rider and get denied by their commission. And last up, we have legislative action by which legislatures can authorize payment upfront for these investments, often with a set of criteria that have to be met, performance criteria that have to be met to recover. And next page, please. So as you approach a grid modernization strategy for your utility, we recommend a tops-down approach that has four main steps. The first one is the strategic direction and vision. This should be aligned around the organization with more than just the T&D group. Groups like IT, customer operations, regulatory affairs, R&D, and legal are likely to be engaged in this effort. And this step really should define what you need to be able to do in the future that can't be done today, and why is that important to the customer and the utility. Next step is harnessing the collective brainpower of a diverse group to identify the investments that provide that capability, and harmonizing those investments with each other. The third step, once the investments are collected, they need to be prioritized and sequenced to identify which investments should be undertaken first and how they deliver a layered, sort of wedding cake looking evolution of capabilities and benefits over time. And last is where the rubber hits the road, and that's implementation, designing the appropriate governance, project plans, and reporting structures to monitor the progress. Last page, please. So in closing, we've got a couple of thoughts on grid modernization as states and utilities are undertaking this throughout the industry. First is, though utilities have been prudently using the latest technologies, a concerted push for grid modernization is being driven by a confluence of 5 factors which require utilities to develop new capabilities. Grid modernization activity continues across the U.S., and it's not just happening in the bellwether jurisdictions like California, New York, and Hawaii, but it's taking place in other places as well, like Ohio, Massachusetts, Illinois, and Rhode Island. And third, there's no one-size definition for what grid modernization is or isn't, and what investments comprise a grid modernization initiative. But there are common themes around enabling greater customer engagement, enhancing the reliability, resiliency, and flexibility of the grid, and more efficiently using grid assets. And fourth, it's not a blank check for grid modernization. The regulators are requiring rigorous cost-benefit justification for investments, and we're seeing some grid modernization riders make it through and some not. So that is it for grid modernization. I'll turn it back over to Kristen for our next speaker.
Thanks very much, Chris. And now we're going to move to Jennifer Nelson, who's going to discuss gas and power infrastructure development. Jennifer?
Thanks, Kristen. You just heard how electrification and grid modernization could provide new opportunities for electric utilities. However, these opportunities will likely require investment in transmission to bring them to fruition. During this segment, I'll review the current state of electric transmission as well as natural gas pipeline infrastructure investment. Then I'll discuss some challenges these sectors are facing, in particular how increased regulatory participation and greater project scrutiny is impacting development going forward. Next slide, please. So starting with electric transmission investment, what are the current trends? More than 1,100 circuit miles of power transmission are currently under construction, and about 6,200 circuit miles of new transmission is planned. Nearly 80% of planned transmission additions are for reliability, whereas about 13% are for renewable resource integration. According to EEI, those two factors, reliability and renewables integration, are expected to continue to drive transmission investment over the next several years. Specifically, investment is expected to focus on upgrading and replacing aging infrastructure, system hardening and resiliency to minimize adverse catastrophic events, and fundamental improvements to comply with evolving transmission reliability and security compliance standards. While transmission investment continues to grow, the rate of growth is slowing. As you can see in the chart on the left, completed miles of transmission lines have declined year over year from 2013 to 2017. In terms of dollars spent, as the chart on the right shows, while investment increased $7.1 billion from 2009 to 2013, investment rose just $2.6 billion from 2013 to 2016. Similarly, transmission rate-based growth has slowed to 9.3% over the last year, down from 19% growth 3 years ago. Next slide, please. So how does that investment break down across the regions? The two charts here illustrate transmission investment by NERC region in both circuit miles and in dollar terms. First, in terms of circuit miles, many of the additions are planned for the Midwest, as well as the Rocky Mountain West and Mid-Atlantic, areas with high amounts of wind penetration. In terms of dollars, however, the PJM and the West are driving the increase in spending. So what accounts for the difference? In the PJM, spending has been more focused on grid modernization and smart grid technologies. For example, FirstEnergy's Energizing the Future program aims to replace aging equipment with advanced smart grid technologies designed to enhance system reliability and reinforce the current system in light of coal plant closures. After an initial investment of $4.2 billion over the 2014 to 2017 timeframe, FirstEnergy expects to invest another $4.2 billion to $5.8 billion through 2021. Next slide, please. So now let's look at how FERC Order 1000 is working to encourage competitive transmission. To recap, FERC Order 1000, issued in 2011, made reforms to encourage broader participation in transmission development, creativity in solving transmission issues, and greater cost control of transmission projects. FERC has been monitoring whether and how non-incumbent transmission providers have been participating in development opportunities. So how have the non-incumbents fared? Between 2013 and 2016, non-incumbents submitted 47% of all proposals for transmission in the California ISO, the PJM, the New York ISO, and MISO. However, with the exception of the California ISO, non-incumbents have had little success in winning transmission awards. In transmission planning areas with competitive proposal windows, non-incumbents had no proposals selected in 2016, a decline from 20% 3 years ago. Next slide, please. So now let's look at FERC's policy regarding transmission investments, transmission incentives and the return on equity, which of course is of keen interest to state regulators and the ultimate customers who pay those rates. So turning to transmission incentives, in 2006, FERC issued Order 679, which aimed to promote transmission investment through increased returns on equity, the ROE, and other incentives based upon project type, risk, participation in an RTO or ISO, and other considerations. FERC issued a policy statement in 2012 to provide guidance to firms seeking those transmission incentives. The table here outlines some recent incentives authorized by the FERC for electric transmission projects. Recently, however, FERC Commissioner Richard Glick has expressed interest in re-examining those transmission incentives, specifically adders for standalone transmission companies. For example, the FERC reduced ITC's Transco adder from 50 basis points to 25 basis points finding that ITC's merger with Fortis had reduced but not eliminated the ITC company's independence from market participants. And just a couple weeks ago, we saw that FERC issued an order proposing a new methodology for determining the base ROE for electric transmission owners in the wake of the DC Circuit Court's remand of Opinion 531 back in April of 2017. The FERC's proposal moves away from its reliance on the DCF methodology and instead proposes to average the results of poor methodologies and set a zone of reasonableness based on a company's relative risk profile. The FERC has stated it hopes that this revised policy will provide clarity as well as address the pancaking of complaints that it needs to work through. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to shift to the natural gas sector. First, taking a look at the trends in natural gas production. Of course, production in shale gas production in the Marcellus, Utica, and Permian regions have grown. Specifically, those three regions have grown by, in the Permian, Marcellus, and Utica basins have grown by 71%, 26%, and 65% respectively over the last 2 years. Combined, production in those three basins account for 46% of U.S. dry gas production in 2017. Not surprisingly, many recent additions of pipeline capacity provide transportation from these productive regions to market areas as the growing production from these prolific plays continue to motivate a large number of greenfield pipeline projects. Next slide, please. So how is that playing out in pipeline development projects? According to the EIA, gas pipeline projects totaling more than 28 BCF a day and nearly $25 billion are currently under construction in the U.S. About 36 BCF a day of new U.S. pipeline capacity is projected to come into service over the next year. However, as we saw with the electric transmission sector, the pace of pipeline infrastructure development is slowing. As the pie chart on the left illustrates, much of the development in the next year is in the under construction or advanced development stage. However, looking out to 2020 to 2024, most proposed pipeline projects are in the very early stages of development. Whereas 26.6 BCF a day of capacity was approved by FERC in 2017, through August, only 5.2 BCF a day has been approved in 2018. So next slide, please. So one factor accounting for the slowing pace of development is increased participation by stakeholders in the regulatory process. Increasingly, opposition and growing interest in greenhouse gas impacts are posing hurdles to development, resulting in project delays and longer lead times. So if we look at the New England and Northeast U.S. region specifically, while gas pipeline capacity into New England is arguably needed for power reliability, especially in the winter, several proposed projects have been delayed or canceled. Some of those projects are the Northeast Energy Direct project, the Constitution Pipeline, and the Access Northeast project. Local and state opposition has been active and much of that organized environmental opposition is part of a broader debate over expansion of hydrocarbon infrastructure. However, smaller expansion or looping projects, such as the Coast to Coast project or C2C, PNGTS's Portland Express project, the PXP, and the Connecticut Expansion project have moved forward. They have faced fewer hurdles, but still have faced some opposition. Given the number of pipeline projects proposed, FERC continues to review its process to determine necessity. FERC recently opened an investigation to re-examine its pipeline certification approach and determine whether a refresh is needed. Ultimately, however, the market will continue to drive or constrain project development. Next slide, please. As the table here shows, the trend of greater resistance and increased stakeholder participation in the regulatory process is not just in New England, but playing out across the U.S. The Penn East Pipeline Project, Mountain Valley, Atlantic Coast, Atlantic Sunrise, and Sable Train projects pipeline projects have all seen resistance and delays. For the electric sector, opposition has been particularly acute for transmission projects passing through a state to provide power elsewhere, where stiff opposition occurs due to the lack of sufficient perceived benefits for local residents beyond construction jobs from installation of the power lines. For example, the Northern Path project to bring clean Canadian hydropower to Massachusetts was stymied after New Hampshire officials refused to issue a siting permit. Massachusetts utilities, who had initially selected the Northern Path project in its clean energy RFP, instead selected the Northern New England Clean Energy Connect project to deliver Canadian hydropower through Maine. The Grain Belt Express, also another project that has received opposition, is a project which aims to carry Kansas wind power through Missouri and Illinois into Indiana, and it has been embroiled in a county-by-county consideration in Missouri, as 2 Missouri counties have vowed to deny permits to the project. The implication here is that projects are going to receive more information requests. Stakeholders are going to request more meetings and hearings, resulting in increased regulatory, legal, and compliance costs, and ultimately delays in project in-service dates. Next slide, please. So what are some takeaways? First, infrastructure projects are continuing to push ahead, albeit at a slower pace due to challenges and increased development times. Large electric transmission projects continue to face state and local challenges, especially where local benefits are unclear. Smaller natural gas pipeline projects may face fewer challenges but still receive opposition. For example, NERC has said that lead times can be up to 15 years for permitting, siting, and construction. The implication there is developers and end-user beneficiaries of these facilities will need to be increasingly engaged in communities and the political and regulatory arenas to convey the benefits of infrastructure projects. As we also discussed, competitive transmission continues to face headwinds as non-incumbents appear to have few successes in the transmission development process. FERC Order 1000 has had mixed success encouraging competition to build new power lines. Although more non-incumbent transmission developers are bidding on proposals and building projects, most new infrastructure is still being built by incumbent utilities. Lastly, uncertainty at the FERC. FERC is considering policy changes that may affect infrastructure development, specifically regarding pipeline certifications and financial incentives for electric transmission. Some decisions may be delayed as one seat remains vacant. So we're seeing that this uncertainty, including an even division among commissioners politically, and its reconsideration of major policies could contribute to delays and impact development going forward. So I'm going to turn it back over to Kristen, and thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Jennifer. And with that, I'm actually going to turn it over to our Director of Research, Greg Litra, who is going to guide us through some of the questions that have come in. Greg?
Thanks, Kristen. A few follow-up questions for our speakers today. And I guess I'll try to sprinkle them around a little bit to the different speakers. First, for Justin, on electrification, we saw from those studies that they suggest that electric vehicles will be a very large component of the forecasted electrification load growth. Now, what can electric utilities, given this growth, do to prepare for the high penetration of these electric vehicles?
Thanks, Greg. So there are a lot of electric utilities can do, not just to prepare, but to encourage and incentivize EVs, and we see that happening today. So a lot of utilities are looking at time of use rates, which incentivize EV owners to charge during off-peak hours. We also see utilities building out infrastructure, both public and private residential chargers to support EVs. And in some cases, we've seen utilities be able to actually rate base that infrastructure and earn a return on it. So it's interesting to watch around the country, kind of state by state, what's being proposed and what's being approved by the various regulatory agencies. One of the more interesting recent models to come out is XL Energy recently proposed a subscription service where EV owners would just pay a set bill for charging and equipment each month.
Very good. Thank you. Second question is for Chris. Chris, during your presentation, you described a framework to justify cost effectiveness. How do you know where the line is between something that you need for reliability versus a discretionary investment?
Yeah. Thanks, Greg. I think those types of frameworks where you can draw everything in a 2x2 sort of only work on paper and in the minds of consultants. The reality is a lot messier. I saw a comment to that effect in the chat box as it scrolled past, and I think what really part of the challenge with defining grid modernization investments is making that determination for what's necessary and should be treated using that least cost best fit model versus what needs a separate analysis. And we've sort of seen states increasingly move towards those customized analyses like New York Rev with the BCA analysis that provide some additional benefits if the investment's environmentally friendly, but then seems to get applied more broadly and hit more investments. So I think really crisp definitions help you wherever you go, but the specific approach in any state will vary depending on where you are.
Thank you. Next question is for Jennifer. Jennifer, you alluded to some changes ahead at the FERC, which is in the news a lot these days, it seems. What specific changes do you see, and how might those changes impact future infrastructure development?
Sure. So I think I see 4 areas of change going on at the FERC that could shape electric and gas infrastructure in the near term. The first, obviously, is the commission makeup. There's a seat vacant right now. Bernard McNamee has been nominated to fill Commissioner Powelson's seat, but there's currently a split, a 2-to-2 split between the Democratic commissioners, Glick and LaFleur, and the 2 Republican commissioners, Chatterjee and McIntyre. And of course, last week, Commissioner Chatterjee took over as chair. So there's some moving parts there that the FERC will need to kind of work through to move some of these orders forward. The second piece is the recent ruling on the income tax allowance for MLPs in the natural gas sector. That's driving MLP roll-ups to the corporate parent. We've already seen Spectra Energy Partners, Boardwalk, Williams Partners, and EnLink all start going through some of those transitions. The third, as I mentioned, the new proposal on the return on equity and recent rulings in Transco adders. And the fourth being potential regulatory changes for the certification of pipeline projects. So recent orders on these pipeline certifications have really brought to a head the difference of opinion split along the FERC commissioners. And as we know, that vacancy, a 2-2 split on issues, could leave FERC powerless to move projects forward. It can't issue a final order, which could effectively block new pipeline certifications. So I think that vacancy, while it could provide some leverage for the dissenting commissioners, it's likely to contribute to the delay in infrastructure development.
Great, thank you. Next one is for Chris. You mentioned that it was important to make sure that grid solutions work individually and holistically. How does that work in an organization, particularly a large organization? And how do you make sure that holistic view is represented?
Sure. So that dates back to the slide on the process by which you go about approaching your grid modernization investments. And really it starts with that first step of making sure that the right groups are involved in setting the vision and the goals of grid modernization for what capabilities you need in the future, and then carrying that forward into that brainstorming about what projects get you there. And I think once you have the right people together, one of the ways you can develop that is through use cases. So you can translate something sort of broad and fuzzy like improved reliability down into its piece parts. One of them being something like use SCADA switches to perform fault location, isolation, and service restoration, or blizzard. Once you have that, you sketch out all the different actors and the systems that are involved in making that happen, and you can then make sure that your switches are communicating properly through your ADMS and bring together the piece parts as a bigger sum than, the sum is greater than the piece parts.
Next question is for Justin. The electrification scenarios you discussed are over a very long time period, so up to 2050. Are there some signposts or early indicators to watch to see if these forecasts will be realized?
Yeah, so I mentioned that some of the key drivers of electrification are going to be advances in the efficiency and the cost of the technologies, consumer adoption of those technologies, and any policy to incentivize or mandate the use of some of them. I think given what we saw about the transportation sector really being the largest and most immediate opportunity, I think what we see in terms of EV adoption is going to be an early indicator of whether or not these scenarios are really coming true. We just hit 1 million EV sales total. I think it was last month. So that's a milestone along the way, but still a long way to go. I mean, it's still less than 1% of the transportation sector in total. So that's probably the indicator to watch.
Thank you. Next question is for Jennifer. You had mentioned that FERC is looking at changing incentives for power transmission development. What are the key takeaways from its proposed electric return on equity methodology?
So good question. This is something we're definitely hearing a lot about in the last week or so. So if you recall, in Opinion 531, the FERC changed its methodology for determining the ROE for electric transmission to a two-step DCF methodology. And it set the ROE at the midpoint between the median and the upper end of the zone of reasonableness to account for what it saw as anomalous market conditions. In its new proposed methodology, the FERC said it was going to take two steps. First, it would establish a composite zone of reasonableness using three methodologies: the DCF analysis, a CAPM analysis, and an expected earnings analysis. Any complaint proceedings that were not dismissed at that point, so in other words, if it fell within that zone of reasonableness, the FERC would dismiss the complaint. But if it fell outside that zone of reasonableness, the FERC would move on to a second step, which would involve the FERC determining a just and reasonable ROE by averaging equally 4 separate cost of equity estimates, the 3 methods I mentioned earlier, and averaging those with the results of a risk premium analysis. But I think some interesting findings and statements from the FERC on the order are that the FERC said they don't believe the DCF methodology alone captures how investors view utility returns, because investors themselves do not rely on the DCF alone, and that other methods used by investors do not necessarily produce the same results as the DCF. So therefore, the FERC found it was appropriate to consider the combination of the DCF, the CAPM, which is the capital asset pricing model, the risk premium, and the expected earnings approaches. So they really said, we're going to look at how investors analyze and compare their investment opportunities. And they said that relying on multiple financial models makes it more likely that our decision will accurately reflect how investors are making their investment decisions. The FERC also more clearly defined the ranges of just and reasonable ROEs based upon a utility's risk profile. So I think this is really an interesting order. We're going to see, how participants respond as the FERC directed parties to submit briefs and weigh in on its proposal.
Thank you, Jennifer. And I guess the last question is really kind of a twofer. The first question is, can a state modernize its grid before rolling out AMI? And the second part of the question, is, would you include Illinois in the states driving grid modernization? So maybe it's for Chris and Kristen as well.
Okay, so I'll start with the Illinois part of the question first. So in 2011, this is one of the states where legislative action drove grid modernization. So in 2011, the Illinois legislature passed the Energy Infrastructure Modernization Act, which authorized $3.2 billion to be spent by ComEd and Ameren to modernize the grid, focused primarily on distribution level investments, and importantly treated AMI as a foundational investment to that modernization process. Subsequently, in 2017, the Future Energy Jobs Act had significant provisions related to distributed generation, renewables, interconnection of DG behind the meter, et cetera. And again, some very innovative rate making to support all of that. That built entirely on the infrastructure that was built out in 2011. We actually have a white paper on our website that talks about this in detail, and the manner in which the regulatory side was treated in Illinois is both interesting and informative for those who are looking to make these investments. Chris, did you want to speak to the AMI question?
Yeah, and to the AMI question, I think Illinois is a great example of this, of can you modernize before rolling out AMI? I think the answer there is something like you can. There are certainly utility actions you can take that aren't dependent on AMI, but it's a lot more difficult. And what you miss out on without AMI is the customer engagement offerings that are tied to the more granular usage information that's collected. You can still do things like SCADA switching and ADMS and back-end systems, but without that piece of customer usage that sort of orders of magnitude expands the number of endpoints that you're looking at, you are missing a customer angle to the piece that is frankly very important.
All right, so I think that brings us to the close of our webinar. So I'll start off by thanking again our speakers. Really appreciate your remarks today. Thank you all, our attendees. The Energy Industry Update is our view of what's important and relevant in the industry today. If your organization would like to hear more about any of these topics or those in the EIU as well, please contact us. We'd love to talk to you about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kristen. And for our audience, we hope you've enjoyed today's presentation. As you log off, please take a moment to complete our survey and give us your feedback so we can continue to provide you with quality content. Thank you for attending, and this does conclude today's presentation.